professionals in the industry, but we don't really cater to the beginners all that often. And so that's what tonight is all about. So we're going to cover the absolute basics you need to know about web development. And also at the end, I'll give you kind of some next steps that you could go into if you're interested in learning more. Before I get into it, I want to start with a little bit of a history lesson about kind of the internet in general. And the reason I'm doing this is because as we get into some of the code, you'll realize that things in the past have kind of affected the way we make websites today. And I feel like it'll answer some questions that may come up. So back in 1989, a researcher by the name of Tim Berners-Lee created the very first website. He created what he called the World Wide Web. And it was in its infancy. He had no idea that it was going to be this thing that people built their businesses on and built applications on. It was originally just meant as a way for documents to have links inside of them that could open up documents on other people's computers somewhere else. That was the whole concept behind the World Wide Web at the very beginning. So just documents linking to other documents somewhere in the world. And like I said, the reason I mention that is because in the beginning, no one had any idea what it would turn into. And so as we look at some of the code that we're going to get into, it won't make sense in kind of our modern context of a website. But if you think about them as documents and how we're kind of building documents at its core, I feel like it'll make things a little bit more clear. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to jump into a little bit of code. So if you want to follow along, I'm going to be using a website called CodePen. And CodePen is just a website to allow you to write HTML and CSS code in your web browser and then automatically preview it. So it's going to run your code for you. You don't have to worry about installing anything. So I'm going to be using CodePen. You can sign up for an account. You can also use it anonymously. To get started, I'm going to go to Create and click New Pen. They call projects like pens in here. And we're presented with this user interface where we have these 3 panels up here at the top. And these are little editors where we can write code. So in this one, we write our HTML code. In this one, we write our CSS code. And in this one, we write JavaScript code. JavaScript is a much more different topic that we're not going to get into very much. JavaScript is actually what's called a programming language. It takes a little bit more of a different skill set to use than just HTML and CSS on its own. And so we're going to really ignore this for tonight. It's something you can get into later, but it's kind of beyond the scope of this presentation. So I can just drag these around and just move that one out of the way. So HTML and CSS are 2 different languages. They're not programming languages like JavaScript, but they're still languages that a browser can understand. The first and most important one is HTML. It stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And this is a language used to describe the contents of a document. Like I mentioned earlier, websites are kind of just like documents. So a web browser looks at this HTML code and then also looks at your content that you have in this HTML code. And this code will tell the browser what pieces of content are what. So if we think of a document, we might have a big title up at the top of the document, and then maybe some paragraphs underneath it. HTML is a way to tell the browser that this piece of content is a title, and this piece of content is a paragraph. So let me go ahead and make this bigger. Can you guys read that? Should I make it bigger?
A little bigger.
A little bigger. How's that? Okay. So let's start with what HTML calls tags. So an HTML tag is the identifier to denote a piece of content, and they come in pairs. You have an opening tag and a closing tag. They look almost identical with one slight difference that I'll get into. And each tag has a name. So for instance, if we want to add a paragraph to our document, we would add what's called a paragraph tag. And the syntax for a tag is the less than symbol, the name of the tag, which in this case is a paragraph tag, but it's shortened to just the letter P, and then a greater than symbol. So this piece of text right here is our opening tag. And then we go ahead and add some content. So I'll say, I'm a paragraph. And then we add the closing tag, which looks the exact same, except for just before we repeat the name here, we add a /. And so that what's no / denotes an opening tag, / denotes a closing tag. And so if you'll look at this little preview, it's kind of already ran our code and it's showing us the output. We don't have those tags in our output, and that's because the browser is looking at those, and then it understands the content inside of it and removes them and displays it.
Can you make it a little bigger still?
A little bit bigger. Is that good? Okay. So this is, like I said, a paragraph tag. There's other types of tags as well, such as heading tags. These are kind of how you would show a title in your document. So a heading tag, there's actually 6 different sizes of headings that come built in. And a heading tag looks just like the paragraph tag, except for you use H as the tag name and then a number. And this number is the size of the heading, with 1 being the biggest and 6 being the smallest. So then I can add my closing one in here. And then if I say I'm heading, and we look at our output, this piece of text is a lot larger. We told the browser this bit of content is a heading, render it as such. And then we said this piece of content is a paragraph, render it as such. So those are, and like I said, there's other sizes, so we could change both of these to 2 and get a slightly smaller heading. Also, neat little trick, CodePen will change the closing tag to match the opening tag whenever you change one of them. And so now the heading is slightly smaller. I could once again change it to 3 and get a slightly smaller one, and all the way down to 6. So those are tags in their most basic form. And that's really just kind of the main concept of HTML. Once you understand how these tags work, the rest of it's honestly pretty easy. I'll show off a couple of other tags that you'll use fairly often. As I mentioned, the whole concept behind websites was the ability to link a document to another one. So let's add a link into our document. Links are denoted using an anchor tag, which is shortened to just A. So I can add a link into my document by adding an anchor tag and adding some content in here. And so I'm just going to make this link take me to Google. And on its own, the anchor tag does absolutely nothing. It actually looks just like a paragraph tag. And that's because the anchor tag needs a little bit more information besides just our content. The anchor tag needs to know where to go when you click on it, what URL to send your browser to. And this is where another concept that's kind of an addition to tags comes in, and that's called attributes. So an HTML attribute is some extra information that goes along with a tag. So for an anchor tag, that extra piece of information would be the URL that we want you to go to when you click. So an attribute looks like this. Inside of your opening tag, you add the name of the attribute, and for anchor tags, this specific attribute that I've been talking about is called href. And then you put an equal sign and 2 sets of double quotes. And then inside of those double quotes, you add that extra piece of information. So in this scenario, it was the URL to Google. So this attribute is telling this anchor tag that when we click on it, we want the browser to navigate to this document somewhere else on the internet. And the content has changed. I now have like a little underline on it, and if I click on it, I can open this in a new tab so I don't lose what I'm working on, and it opens up to Google. So that's an anchor tag, another vital piece of websites. Another one, and this is kind of one of those tags that's a little bit different than the rest of them. This kind of ignores some rules about how in HTML you have an opening tag and a closing tag, and that tag is the image tag. And this is how you add images into your documents. So let's go grab an image. Open image, view image, there we go. So I'm going to copy this URL for this image into my clipboard, and I'll use it in a second. So to add an image into our web page, we create an image tag, shortened to just IMG, And we don't add a closing tag. This is one of the interesting HTML tags. With an image, the content is actually the image itself, and we can't like just paste the like image itself into our document here. We need to like link it from somewhere else. And for that reason, image tags don't have a closing tag because there's no content associated with it besides the image. And so to actually tell this image tag where the image is located, we use another attribute. In this case, it's what's called the source attribute, shortened to just src. So we say src equals, and then our double quotes, and then we just throw the link to the image right in there. And boom, the browser loads that image and displays it into our web page. And this, like I said, there's no closing tag because there's no other content associated with it. There's one more concept I'm going to cover before we kind of switch gears and go into the CSS side of things. And that's the concept that HTML tags can be nested. So let's say I want this, this word paragraph here for some reason to link to Google. I can do that by surrounding just the word paragraph in an anchor tag and then adding the href property to it. Oops, got to add a space in there. And then our link to Google. And now just the word paragraph will actually link to Google when we click on it. But the important concept here is that we can have an HTML tag that lives completely within another tag. And you actually do this quite often. You'll nest things somewhat deep in certain scenarios to get the correct layout or whatever it is you're trying to do. The main important part is that whenever you have one of these opening tags, you need to close it in the correct order. It would be incorrect if this closing anchor tag was on the outside of the paragraph tag. You're supposed to, whenever you open a tag, that should be the last one that you close, if that makes sense. Okay, so does anyone have any questions about this HTML stuff so far? Okay. Next, we'll jump into some basics of CSS. So CSS is a different language than HTML. It does very different things. HTML is how you structure documents. CSS, which stands for cascading style sheets, is a special language for telling the browser how to change the look of your document. So, for instance, this heading right here, by default, the browser has kind of already chosen a font. It's already chosen a color and a size. With CSS, we can change all of those things. So, and the semantics and like the code for CSS looks quite different. So let's write our first line of CSS code. So I'm in the CSS panel here, and what's also really cool is CodePen automatically hooks these up. Normally, you would write your CSS file or CSS code in like a separate file than your HTML code, and then there's some special bits of HTML code to link those two together. CodePen is already doing that for us, which makes it super easy. So let's say I want this heading right here to have a red color. So let's just start super basic and we'll change that. So CSS starts with every line of CSS code, not every line, but every statement sort of in CSS starts with a selector. So what we want to do is we want to select this h1 and then change some of its properties. So we start by saying h1. We don't do any of the greater than or less than symbols. And then we put curly braces in here. And what this is saying, and then in between these curly braces, we'll actually change the properties that we want to. So in this scenario, we want to change color to red. And if we wait a second, the color of our heading changed to red. So if we look at the syntax one more time, it starts with a selector, and then we add these curly braces, and inside of those curly braces, we add all the properties that we want to apply to this specific selector. So we could have many of these different statements like this in between these curly braces, and they would all apply to this specific selector. I could add another selector, such as I could grab the paragraph tag, and I could change like its font size. to be something like 20 pixels. Pixels are just shortened to px, and it grew just a little bit in size. So this is a different selector and a different set of properties that we're modifying. Another thing about the syntax is that you always start with a property. Every line should have a property, a colon, and then the value that you want to change that property to. So in this case, we're changing the color to red. And then every line should end with a semicolon, at least every line that changes a property. Let's see. So we kind of come across an interesting problem here, is that if I copy this paragraph tag in my HTML code, it's going to be the same size as the one before it. And there's not, based on what I've shown you so far, there's not a way to like select just this paragraph tag on the page. What we're doing is we're actually selecting all of them on the page and changing all of them to be this size. And so CSS provides another utility, in fact, a couple of utilities to get more specific. We can make the selector part more specific. And one of the most basic ways to do that is using what are called classes and IDs. So we'll start with an ID. If I come over here to this, this specific paragraph tag right here, and I say, I add an attribute called ID, and I set that equal to some characters, I'll just call this my ID, then in my CSS code here, I can use a pound symbol to denote that I'm looking for an ID, and then I can say my ID, and then add some curly braces, and then we can change something about that specific one, like we'll change the color to blue. And so now, everything except for the anchor tag that's nested inside of that paragraph has actually turned blue. And it's only that specific one, because we only added the ID to that specific paragraph tag. Another way to get more specific is to use classes. So I'll add another H1 here on the page. And let's say right now all the H1s are being red. Let's make this top H1 larger. So I'll say class larger. So we're using a class this time instead of an ID. And then in my CSS code, I'll use a dot to denote a class. And I'll say larger, and then I'll say font size, and we'll make this really big, like 40 pixels. Now this one got just a little bit larger. So in all reality, the IDs and classes act almost the exact same. They're both just a way to make things a little bit more specific. There is one key difference, and it's really, for reasons we're not getting it into right now, an ID should ever only be used once on a page, at least for this name. Like, if I added an ID to this heading right here that was also called my ID, that would be incorrect. I have two IDs with the same name on the page, and that is not valid. It'll work. The CSS is working here. This turned blue because our my ID has its color set to blue. But when you get into making websites more accessible, meaning people who are blind and use screen readers, or people who can only use a keyboard, having multiple IDs on the page can kind of confuse some of those pieces of software, as well as cause a whole bunch of other problems. So that's why there are classes. Classes are meant to be reused many times on the same page. So I could copy this larger class, and I could come over here and add it to this paragraph tag right here, and that's perfectly valid. That's actually what the class is used for. So that's classes and IDs. Let's kind of put some of, like, kind of all of this knowledge, stuff I went over, into a little bit more of a practical use case. Practical, but still very simple. Let's make a button, just a simple button that doesn't look like garbage like this. So I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of all of this code right here. It's not super important, just for demo. And I'm going to get rid of all of the CSS code. So I'm going to make an anchor tag look like a button. So we'll go ahead and create our anchor tag. I'll say A, and we'll just point this to, the Web Devs site. And we'll go ahead and add our href on here to actually make it work. we'll just copy this URL. Okay, so now this will link us to Web Devs. I'm also going to show you another tag real quick. This is a break tag. It's a way to add like a line break. It's similar to like hitting enter in Word, just a blank line. And I'm just doing that to move it down and add a little bit of spacing up top. CSS can also be used to change the spacing of elements, but that gets a little bit more advanced, and don't want to go too deep into that tonight. But if you have questions afterwards, by the way, I'm on the Web Dev Slack. Hit me up anytime, and also afterwards I'll hang around for anyone that has questions. So we also want to make this reusable. Let's say we'd want like anything in our website to be a button, or different anchor tags at least. So I'm going to use a class in that case. So I'll say class button. It's pretty simple. And then we'll come over here to our CSS panel, and we'll add our button class here. And now let's start thinking about the things that we want to change. So for starters, I don't really want this underline here. On anchor tags specifically, to remove the underline, we use a property called text decoration, and we can set that to none. And now our anchor tag no longer has that underline. Okay, to make it look like a button, we could add like a background color to the whole tag. So let's go find a decent looking color. There's this website, Flat UI Colors. I use it for picking colors that don't look trashy. And we'll come over here and we'll say background color, and I'll paste that value that that website just gave me. Ignore this for now, and I actually kind of want to touch on this just a little bit. Before I was using red and blue. There's also like white, black, and a whole bunch of other rainbow basic colors. But there's a whole like massive ecosystem of colors you can use when you use this format. This format is called hexadecimal. It uses a combination of letters and numbers to represent a color. You don't really have to understand how to read it. Just know that in CSS, whenever you use a hash in a value like this, and then you have those letters and numbers, that means a color. And in this specific scenario, that color is this blue background here. Okay, so we've added our background color. Still doesn't look great. Let's change the font color, which we do with just color. And I'll set that to just be white. It's looking a little bit better. We kind of want some spacing in between the words and the edge of the background. And this is getting a little bit into some CSS spacing stuff. We aren't going to go too deep into it. But to change the distance between content and kind of the edge of the background, we use a property called padding. So I can say padding is 15 pixels. And what this does is adds 15 pixels of padding onto every side of this button. 15 pixels of padding in between the edge of the border, or at the edge of the background and the actual content. Which also means that, like, you know, if I added more in here, it would grow with it. It's not limited to that. This font isn't also great. I forget what the default font is that the browser uses most of the time. You change the font itself using a property called font family. I'm just going to set that to a super simple one. So one thing to note when you're making websites is that you can use any of the fonts that are on your computer, but if you actually send a website out to the world, your users also need to have that font as well. So you kind of have to be a little bit careful about which fonts you choose to use. You can actually add a space right here and list another font, and so if the first font isn't installed on that user's computer, it'll fall back to the next font. And there's also a way, using some special stuff in HTML, you can include a font. So when a user visited your website, the first thing the browser would do is maybe download that font. And so there's ways to do custom fonts, but it's just something to be aware of. Other users might not see the font that you chose. So this is looking a lot better. It's kind of looking like an actual button. There's a couple more things that I think we should change. Rounded corners, not rounded corners, both of them look okay. Let's go ahead and add rounded corners onto this. And let's add a border. So I'm going to go choose I chose this light blue. choose this darker blue this time, and I'll add a border to this. So there's a border property that we can change, and the border property actually takes 3 values. Most of these that we've been using only take 1, but border takes 3. The first is the size of the border in pixels, so I'll say 2. The second value it takes is the type of border. You can have dashed and dotted borders, and also solid borders. So we'll just go with solid. And then the third is the color of the border. So I'll add that color here. And now we have a little bit of like a darker border around here. Might be a little bit hard to see. I'll make it a little bit bigger. And then we can change the, we can add rounded corners using a property called border radius. And I'll set that to like 5 pixels. And now, spelled radius wrong. Now I have rounded corners on my button. So this is a super simple, doesn't look great. I'm not a designer, don't make fun of me, please. But this is, it looks better than the link that was there before. And it shows off a handful of properties out there that we have access to. There's a lot of CSS properties that you can change. Way too many to get into tonight. Okay. So that's kind of the, once you know this about CSS, there's not a whole lot more. There's one more thing that I'll touch on super quickly. Actually, let's do another example. Let's just make like a box without any content in it. That'll show off a couple of more things. So when you want in HTML, when you kind of need to add some classes around other HTML elements, but that element doesn't really mean anything in terms of your document structure, you can use what's called a div tag, which is short for, I think, division. So it's like a division in a web page. And this tag does absolutely nothing on its own. But it's used for kind of wrapping other tags so that you can easily apply certain CSS properties to it. So let's add a couple of paragraph tags in here. So we'll just say hello, 1. We'll copy this. So it's used for this kind of stuff a lot. Like, you need other elements inside of it. For this scenario, it's actually not even going to have any content. We're just going to make it do something with CSS itself. So I'll add a class to this div called box, and then we'll come over here. We'll say dot box. Another property is, so the box needs to have some width and height to it. So there's a width property, so we can say 50 pixels. There's a height property. We can set that to 50 pixels. And then we just need to give it a background color, because right now it's actually just white, so we're not actually seeing anything. So we'll just say background color white. Or not white, black. It's already white. Okay, so now we have a little box in here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Let's make this like 100 pixels. And now let's say we want like another box inside of it. So let's add another div with we'll just call this like box white, and then we'll go ahead and add a class for box white here. And all I'm actually going to do, well, never mind. We'll say background color is white, and then we'll just say width, height. I'm actually pretty sure this will work. I could be forgetting something super simple. There we go. We have a white box nested inside of that. Trying to think of another. Let's add some borders to both of those boxes. Go ahead.
Why are you using background color and not color?
That's a good point. So color is for changing the text color, while background color is specific for changing the background color of something. So in our button example, color changed the text itself, while background color changed the background of it. So that's why I'm using background color over color. It should really be called font color, but like I said at the very beginning, some of these things didn't exist in the beginning, and they were just kind of like tacked on as things went. And so sometimes stuff like that doesn't make clear sense. The thing that I want to show real quick though is let's just add a class called border to just like quickly add like a red border to something. So I'll say 1 pixel solid red. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm adding a class here, and I already have classes on both of these elements, but I want to show off that you can add multiple classes onto elements by just separating them with a space. So now if I add this border class here, this outer box has that border, and I can also add that border class here, and the inner box will also have that border. So you can add as many classes as you want onto things by using a space, separating each class with a space. Okay. That's all the like CSS and HTML stuff that I'll get into right now. I kind of want to end with some more practical stuff. Writing CSS in particular takes some time to pick up. I'm still learning things about CSS every day, and I've been doing it for like maybe a couple years. And so one thing that you can use to get going like really fast to actually like build a real website that people could use is to use what's called a CSS framework. A super duper popular one is called Bootstrap. It's made by, that is not the website. Bootstrap. Bootstrap is made by Twitter and maintained by Twitter. They add new features to it all the time. But it's actually just, at its core, it's really just a CSS file with a whole bunch of classes in there kind of already made for you. So you don't have to worry too much about actually getting into the nitty-gritty of writing the CSS. All you really have to do is just kind of add your content and add special classes onto the HTML parts of it, and it kind of makes all the magic happen for you. So I'm going to go ahead and add it really quick to my little CodePen project. So I'm on the, I went to the home page and I clicked Get Started, and right here they have this section called CSS. This is the CSS file that is Bootstrap. So I'll go back to my CodePen. I'll go into these, I'm going into this little settings section right here, and I'm going into this stuff for head. I'm not going to get too into what this all means. I have great resources for learning a lot more about that at the end of the day, but at the end of the presentation, I mean. But what this has done is it's told CodePen that we want to use Bootstrap in this little project. So now if I go back to Bootstrap and I go to their documentation page, oh, well, I'm already on that. And I go to, let's look at this components section. And there's a whole bunch of kind of pre-built components. That's what they call these different things in your website. And one of those components is buttons. So if I come over here to buttons, they have kind of some sample code here for me. There's also a button tag in HTML. They're not adding the tag part for this. The button is actually something a browser knows about. What they are adding are all these classes here. So if I copy this bit of code and I go back to my HTML and paste it, just like that, we have like a button already added into our page, and we didn't have to write any CSS to do it. If we want to make changes to that button, like changing its color, Bootstrap has a whole bunch of like built-in colors that they've given names to. So red is referred to as danger, and so now we have a red button. There's tons of them, like info, which is white, so we probably won't. Oh wait, no, that's green. Default is white. There's warning, which is yellow, and so now buttons are just kind of like not something we have to worry about unless we need to make one that looks different than the rest of Bootstrap, which inevitably you'll probably have to come across. But this is just like a super great way to get started quickly. Let's look through some of these other kind of components here. A big one is like navigation bars. Most websites have a navigation bar at the top. This one right here has it. And so they have a whole bunch of code for building navigation bars. So I'm going to scroll down the page and find a simple navigation bar. So here's one where we have like a title and some extra links here. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this section of code that they have. I'm going to go back to my CodePen, delete what I have, and I'm going to paste this in here. And I'm going to go ahead and just minimize the CSS portion of this for now. We have a nav bar here that's kind of hard to see. So if I actually go back to Bootstrap, there's some theming options available too. Let's see. So they have nav bars in different colors. Let's look at the code real quick. So it starts with this nav element. This is something a browser knows about. It denotes that the content in here is a navigation bar, because that's a thing most websites have. We have some anchor tags, we have some buttons, we have a div that's containing this tag called UL. UL is short for unordered list. It's a way to do like bulleted lists. They're just kind of overriding the default styles to actually not look like a bulleted list. It's just a nice way to organize like a collection of links, which is what they're doing. If we kind of drill down even further into this nested stuff here, there's an LI, which stands for list item. It works in conjunction with the UL tag. And then we have an anchor tag. So there's our link that's inside of here. And then we have, next to it, we have an LI tag with another anchor in there. So there's a whole bunch of links right here. And then that's it. So that's the whole nav bar. Now let's look at some of the classes that kind of came with this. So at this top level, we have a nav bar. We have this navbar expand LG. I've used Bootstrap before, and I know what this means. It might be a little bit foreign to you what this does at the beginning, but if you go to the page in the Bootstrap documentation, they have really well written out descriptions about what each of these classes do and how they work together. But for now, what this does is make it so that by default, these navigation bars, they hide all the links underneath this button for viewing on like a mobile device. And this navbar expand LG means that it will remove the button and add all the links in line when you're viewing it on a desktop. Navbar light, this is the theme. Well, this is actually the theme of this changes the text color, while this one, BG, changes the actual background of the navbar. So just barely I was saying, hey, we should change it to be a different color. If I come over here, they have navbar dark, BG dark. That looks like it's going to probably be this black one. So I can come back over here, and I can just swap these classes out. And we have a totally different navbar. Also, just go ahead and remove this expand LG so we can actually see the rest of the content show up. That should just remove some of the... That's actually not going to work. It's not expand LG. LG is short for large, so large screen size in this scenario. In Bootstrap, there's several like built-in screen sizes, so a lot of classes will only apply to certain screen sizes. So I can change this to, I think MD will probably work. There we go. MD is short for medium, so that would mean this class is going to apply for medium screen sizes on up. So now we can actually see all of our links here that are on this navbar. We can kind of drill down a little bit more. This button, this was that like little button that we saw in the mobile view. This div with a class of collapse and navbar collapse, this contains all of the links, and the reason it's wrapped up like that is so that on mobile it can hide everything away. And then we have this navbar nav class, which this is kind of like the nuts and bolts of the navbar itself. And then we have nav items. We have a class called active, which makes this one like highlighted like this, meaning it's kind of the active link. So if these link to other pages on our site, we would change this active class to be on the page that's actually active. And then nav link is the actual link itself. So you have to kind of read through some of this documentation that they've written out about what these different classes do, but I can tell you right away that we would have had to write probably a couple hundred lines, maybe more, of CSS to actually get this same effect. And we were able to do it with having to write all of this HTML as well. So not a lot of time. We threw something together that's usable and doesn't look like absolute garbage, which is kind of the default. Let's look through a couple other basic components. They have one called, let's see, a Jumbotron. This is kind of maybe like an opening, for like an opening header, kind of the first section of your site maybe. And there's this div here with a class of Jumbotron that we can just copy. And we'll come back over here to our HTML document. and we want it to go just underneath the nav bar. And so we'll go ahead and paste that code right there. And if I bring this up, now we have that whole Jumbotron. It looks a little funky because it's all zoomed in right now. But this is pulling in a different font that's a little bit thinner. Reset my zoom. We're changing the default font and size of various pieces of text. Adds a button here, and we can come through and just kind of look at some of the things that it's adjusting. There's also a horizontal rule, which is if you've ever used Microsoft Word, there's horizontal rules, but it's kind of hard to see. It's a super light horizontal rule. If we keep going through some of these, there's also a really extensive grid system. Lots of websites kind of fit into a grid. You'll have maybe a sidebar and then some content over here. And Bootstrap comes with a way to actually split everything up into columns, because a browser doesn't have that feature built in by default, except for in very recent versions of some browsers. So let's go look at the basics of the grid system. I'm trying to remember where it is. Layout. There we go. Grid. Okay, so right here they have a quick little example of a 3-column grid. I'll go ahead and copy their example to our code pen. So we'll put our little grid right underneath our Jumbotron. And boom, we have everything separated out into 3 columns. And I can throw whatever I want into the content of those columns. So this, let's look through kind of some of the classes that goes over the basics of how the grid works. There's this wrapping container around everything. And this container, what it's actually doing is most websites on super large screens, the content itself doesn't go to the edge of the screen. It's kind of contained just a little bit. So that's what the container is doing. It's not something we'll see on a super small screen. Then inside of that, we have a row. That kind of makes sense. Grids have rows and columns. And then we have this COL-SM. It's short for column small. It doesn't mean that it's a skinny column. It actually just means that it's going to be a column on small devices on up. Once you break down into mobile devices, Bootstrap's automatically going to move all of those columns into a single row, so that it looks, all those columns into a single column, so that it looks a lot nicer on a mobile phone. And then because we have 3 of them here, Bootstrap is automatically figuring out a third of what is a third of the screen here. So Bootstrap is doing a lot of work for us. If we actually remove one of these right here, whoops, scroll back down here. If we remove one of the oh goodness, I'll just use. So if we remove one of these columns here, then we scroll back down to our content, it's actually splitting them up evenly. The text inside is aligned to the left, but now we have 2 equal columns. And we didn't have to write any extra code for that. And all we had to do was just actually add 2 columns into our row. So Bootstrap has, once again, a whole bunch of components: buttons, drop downs. They have things for forms, so text inputs and radio buttons. They have all that stuff kind of styled for you so it looks really good. They have a grid system. They have navigation bars. They have footer stuff all built in for you. And you didn't have to write any CSS code to actually make it look like that. There's also a lot of other frameworks besides just Bootstrap. There's one called Semantic UI. There's another one called the Foundation Framework. All of them kind of do the same thing in just slightly different ways. They maybe have different features. But this is a super simple way to get started quickly without having to know a lot about how it all works. But if you do need to kind of break down, you now know some of the basics of the CSS part, so you can get in and customize some of this as well. We're almost out of time. This is kind of most of the content that I wanted to go over. I'll end by saying that, by giving you just kind of some next steps. If this is something that's interesting to you, you want to dig in more, find out more about this, potentially even get a job in this industry. There are people always looking for talented web developers. So there's a couple of things that I would recommend. There's a website called Free Code Camp. This is a 100% free coding boot camp that you take online. There's a whole bunch of interactive lessons. So it's kind of very similar to what I was doing here. You may write some code in the browser and complete lessons. And there's kind of a whole roadmap of how to get you from 0 to actually making websites. There's also a very large community. There's a whole bunch of people using Free Code Camp and also helping the users of Free Code Camp. Lots of people get jobs from going through Free Code Camp. Part of their curriculum is actually finding nonprofits who need projects completed for various things, and they team up 2 people going through the course content to work on that nonprofit project and get it out in the wild, which is a great way to add something to your resume. Another one is W3 Schools. This is not really, I wouldn't recommend going, wow, that is not it. I shouldn't trust my typing ability into URL bars during presentations. W3 Schools. So W3 Schools, the W3C is the organization that's in charge of a lot of web standards. I think that it was actually started by Tim Berners-Lee at some point, the guy who initially created this whole thing. And they created this website, W3 Schools, to kind of teach people about some of these standards. So it also kind of starts off super basic. It's not near as interactive as Free Code Camp. There's not a vibrant community behind it. What I usually use it for is just kind of reference. It's a great way when you're like, oh wait, how does the nav tag actually work? You can Google it. Usually the first result will actually be W3 Schools. So that's just another great resource. I would use it as more of a reference instead of actually like a learning point, but you definitely can. But yeah, once again, Free Code Camp. Sadly, I discovered it much later in my career. I didn't know about it at the beginning, but it is what I wish I would have known about when I was first getting started. I want to open the floor up to any questions at all. There's no dumb questions here, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them right now. Like I said, I'll hang around afterwards if anyone wants to talk one-on-one. Anything? So does everyone understand the basics of HTML and CSS now? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Okay, that's all that I had for now.
Is Bootstrap just is it going to be the new HTML standard that CSS is going away, or is this just a tool to learn by?
It's just a tool to learn by. Like, it's not going to replace CSS in any way. Okay. People still write a lot of CSS because not every website needs to look like Bootstrap, right? People do custom designs on a website all the time. So Bootstrap is just a way to get started, really, and people use it to build real products, but it's not going to replace any of these core technologies anytime soon.
So you could build an enterprise website
off of Bootstrap.
CSS and use it totally, because the browser
right.
can read it.
Yes.
No.
Well, yes, but the thing to note is that Bootstrap is really just a whole bunch of CSS code. Like, that's all that Bootstrap actually is. And so it's not going to replace it in any way. It's kind of just built on top of it. It depends on it.
Bootstrap for Twitter, or just Bootstrap?
Oh, what's that?
Bootstrap for Twitter, or?
It's just called Bootstrap. Some people refer to it as Twitter Bootstrap because Twitter created it. Which, another thing that I'll mention is that Twitter created it, but they have done what's called open sourcing it, which means that all of the code for Bootstrap is out there in the wild, and you can actually read it, so you can like understand how a lot of this works. And I've also put it out there totally free of charge. So there's not going to be the licensing on it is so that you can use it in an enterprise app without any legality issues with Twitter themselves. Okay. Well, like I said, I'll hang around afterwards. If anyone has any other questions. But that's all for me for now. Thank you for coming out.
Do you want to try and pull up the admin real quick?
Oh,
see what
okay.
works? I find it funny that we actually waited until the end to get to an Internet Explorer joke, so you. Cool. So this is, I want to run a test on this real quick. The idea being when we have prizes to give away, we'll log into the admin back here. You want to log into
log into the actual
admin.
admin.
Test it, see if it works, right? So this is dry run for this.
Ooh, I might not have a user account set up on here. Let's see.
I feel like this is just a setup for you to give yourself a prize.
I might have a prize here.
I don't think I know what my password is.
Here.
Do you have a user created?
I got one.
Go for it.
I think Jason Klein remembers my password.
Okay.
Here we go. See if it works. So, let's get that JetBrains license. I don't want. Yeah.
You don't want to give away that? Okay. Ready?
Oh, come on.
Are you ready?
Yep.
3, 2, 1. Ed won.
Freaking Ed. Got some bugs to work out. Try it again. Hit the button again. Yeah. All right.
Dang it. We broke it.
Anyway, okay. Feel free to hang out for a bit. We usually hang out for a while, talk shop. If maybe you had a question you didn't feel comfortable asking in front of everyone, Levi's going to be here for a bit. I'll be here for a bit. And plenty of other people in here be happy to answer. The one event that I do want to pump up a little bit, it's a ways down the road still, but our December meeting will be an interesting one. We're borrowing an idea from the Springfield Creatives group, who did a really cool design contest at their, I think it was their Christmas party that they did. And so the idea being there was multiple designers that kind of, were up on a stage executing a design in front of everyone in real time. And so we're going to do kind of the same thing, but we're going to partner with the creatives and get a really simple redesign of the Web Devs homepage. And we'll have 4 developers. We might even do it in the event space upstairs. Big screens and everything going head to head with the panel of judges selecting one that is the ultimate winner. So that'll be in December. Keep an eye out for that. And then also keep an eye out for the app that'll launch soon. And for the people that were here for the first time, hope to see you out again. But thank you for coming tonight regardless. We'd be happy to answer any questions you guys have. So thanks, and hope to see you next month. Thank you. Yeah. It's been a long time.
It really is.
Oh, that's cool. So you can sit on the side and you probably with their massive project on
Yeah, what's I tried to. Yeah, it's what time should I do that? That works. Yeah, I'll do that.
Well, I might have been set. But I still remember.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember.
Good. Yeah, man. I got this thing going.
They'll be able to keep their program.
I'm actually
This
pretty wild. No, and I was really angry about it. So that's why I went to murder somebody because so you know how it is. You get busy, right? And whoever, it didn't hit our radar. I know, definitely, dude. They heard it from me. So yeah, this came up, and we had to move heaven and try to get stuff, get the usual stuff. Alright, you got a week and a half to do it. Fine.
So I've done some stuff, but
yeah, it's it is printed, yes. This one three others.
yeah, that's great. I don't know. She's like, you can borrow my time.
Yeah, that's
go out to the door. I'm like, you just met me. Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I was trying to explain that this game was before we started it. Dude, whole different beast. You either love it or you hate it, right? Or versus like, you know, like that. Oh, okay. Some people are like born for that mindset.
I pretty much decided that I'm going to create like that's about 30 people. Okay, so it's an awesome thought, and then you get in there and just like, oh, I've specified that goal. I want to just hit. I like that a lot.
Zeros on it.
So like the whole thing is like, right? So Google interviews are like, supposed to be one of the hardest things in the software to do. It's super technical. I want to like understand all the technical stuff to get it off. So I can talk about it. And then like that'll be like my website deadline. Just I turn it down to Google. Like live stream this whole thing. That's wrong. Yeah. Thanks for having me. What's up?
Really? I never won one, so I didn't know like all intuitive or
Yeah.
But a lot of people totally. Well, I think what I like about the code is the technical projects.
Go, man. Take care.
They do it. It's